Hi, everyone. Matt McIver, Artistic Director for the Iowa Stage Theater Company. Here with Dr. Andrea Wilson, playwriting professor at Grandview University and the author of Mahala Island from our Scriptease series, our first in our online Scriptease adventure. So, Dr. Wilson, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate the conversation.
Definitely.
Tell folks who may be less familiar with you a little bit about you, where you're from, how you got started. What's sort of what's your story? What's your backstory here, if you will?
Well, I'm originally from Rochester, New York.
A very fine area where I have family.
Yes. And I, like most writers, I was a reader growing up. Did all the romance reading, the Babysitters Club, Sweet Valley High, that kind of stuff.
Nice.
And when I went to high school, I actually went to a performing arts high school in Rochester for creative writing. So even back then, I knew I liked writing. I just didn't see it as a career because at that time, you really didn't really hear a lot about writers becoming successful. You always heard of the starving artist type thing. So during that time, though, I was taking my creative writing classes, and then I had a bunch of friends that were they were drama majors. And so I wanted to take classes with them too. So I had enough credits, I would take their classes and my classes.
Nice.
And so that really introduced me to theater. And then through those classes, like at that time, I did not have an appreciation for the classics. So I would often want to write my own scenes and monologues and whatnot. And some of the teachers would let me. And so I didn't realize it, but at that time I was starting to build my ability to write for theater. So after that, went to college for psychology, took this long path away from writing.
So where'd you go to school? I mean, I can imagine psychology is not an unuseful thing for a playwright to get dirty.
Right. Well, my education journey is really weird and kind of like a lot of little twists and turns. So I started off at a historically Black college, Virginia Union University. I did that for a semester, then took a semester off and decided I wanted to go somewhere closer to home. So I went to SUNY Brockport, the State University of New York system. So I got my bachelor's in psychology with a minor in African American studies. And then I went to Palm Beach Atlantic in West Palm Beach, Florida, and got a master's in counseling psychology, marriage and family therapy. Because at that time I was convinced I was going to be a psychologist and whatnot. And then I actually moved all the way to California and spent a year in a clinical psychology program, a doctorate program. And by that time I realized I really don't want to be a therapist. I really don't want to be a psychologist. I'm kind of tired of people's problems. They never go away. It's not like an advice columnist where you tell them, how you feel, and then, you never see them again. It's like they keep coming back week after week. You're like, okay,
I told you how to fix this last week.
Right. Some people,
I told you.
And you can't say that. That's the thing about it is you have to be like, oh, okay. And I'm the kind of person, like by the third time, I'm like, look, okay, we done been through the same story, you not listening, got my, so yeah.
The only constant in all your failed relationships is you, Chad. So.
Right. So I can do that now, because I'm not in the field. I can just be like, look, it's not working. So
and then they go from you to the therapist and talk it out. So
right. Yeah, I'm like, go see a therapist, but I'm just gonna tell you right now, you're crazy. So I can do that now. So I left that program and I entered another doctorate program, which was a global leadership with the emphasis in educational leadership.
Nice.
Because the one thing I knew at that time is I loved education. If nothing else, I know I loved education and all that time.
You've been in school for a minute at this point, so you clearly.
Yes. The one common denominator is I like school. and over those years, here and there, I would try to write something, but because I was in school, I could never commit. And so I did that. And at the end of my doctoral program, by that point, I was living in Georgia and the Atlanta area. And I started to write again. Like I felt like over the years, I kept having this urge, feeling, like God told me you need to write. And I kept kind of fighting it. because I was like, I can't make money in writing, you know. But eventually I started writing, and I started off with books, and I published my first book in 2009, and then it was just like
What
book
kind? So
after
tell
book
me
after
about that first published piece, because that's a huge milestone for any author.
book.
What kind of book was it? What was it? Was it going back to sort of the genre roots that you had
Mhm.
started in? Where were you the romance, the Babysitter's Club? Was it
Mhm.
that kind of thing? Was it something different? Was it?
Well, the first book I actually finished writing was a novel that was, you know, women's fiction, romance. But the first book I published was not.
Okay.
It was actually a devotional for business owners. I was living in Atlanta. I had an interior design business because creative types, we just do everything.
Wait. Last I heard, we were getting a doctorate in educational leadership.
Right.
How do we get to interior design? Because you are one of the few people I've talked to who has had about as many jobs as I have.
Oh
I
yeah.
I had as many jobs by the time I was 25 as my father had when he passed at the age of 60.
Well, I will say, like, I've had as many jobs as my age. Like, one day I was like adding it up, like, okay, like, so basically every year, well, it's because a few times I had like 2, 3, 4 jobs at a time, you know, and then
Yeah,
like, just,
and then you
I work, I will work, you know. But yeah, like I've had a gazillion jobs. I mean, everything you could think of. I even worked at a Chinese restaurant for a day. Like, it's just like,
of course you do. Of course. Why not?
yeah, you know. And it was the funny story about it is because I was young at the time, and the people gave us, like, me and my god sister went out, and they gave us these flyers for the Chinese restaurant, and they took us to
Sure.
the Walmart parking lot and told us to put the flyers on the cars. Well, you know, at Walmart the cars are coming in and out, in and out. So every time they would come back to check on us, they would be like, "Well, where's the flyers?" We'd be like, "The cars keep leaving."
People don't just park at
So
Walmart and stay.
it's like, you know, like we're doing the job. They're like, "You're not doing anything." We're like, "Yes, we are." So
That's so.
yeah,
What do they think? Do people just stay at Walmart all day? That's
right. They were just like, "We don't see any cars." We're like, "They keep leaving." So at the end of that, my mom was like, she came, picked us up, and was like, "Pay them. They're not coming back." It was just horrible. So, but hey, you know, maybe one day I'll put that in one of my plays. You
oh,
know,
that's funny.
right?
That's funny. Well,
So,
I think it's
so yeah.
endemic to creative types too. I mean, I was a creative writing major in college,
Hmm.
and so of course, you get out and then you're like, okay, well, what's actually going to pay the bills? Like
Right.
you went into psychology,
Right.
it's very intelligent and reasonable and like an actual profession.
Right.
You end
Right.
up doing all kinds of different stuff. Just it does foster uh, a certain confidence. It's like, okay, we may have economically challenging times. I'm going to find some kind of job. There's
Right.
at this point, with the amount of stuff I've done, something's going to line up with something.
Right. 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 And I still have a few things that I would like to do, but I'm like, stop it. Just stop it. You
Just
know?
do it. Why not?
No, it's like,
You're
it wouldn't even
interior
make sense at this point, you know?
design.
So, like, I secretly want to be a bartender, but I know that would only last like a week, and then I would be like, okay, I'm good.
That's
I've had that
actually
experience. I think it's kind of one of those things like the actors do, where they need like method acting. They need to kind of like completely submerge themselves into what they want to do. So I think
I,
that's writers are like, we need to try this.
get a little experience. I always like bartending better than waiting tables because there's a
Yeah.
certain sense of you're the captain of the ship, and also if you threaten to cut somebody off, they get real nice. Like anybody starts giving you
Mm.
grief as a bartender, you're like, you know what? I think you've had enough. Oh no.
Yeah.
People give you
I
grief
just,
as a waiter. They just keep giving you grief. It doesn't. There's
yeah.
very little
I,
leverage.
I probably wouldn't be any good at it. I'd probably be sneaking drinks when no one's looking. So,
No one does that. That
right,
never happens.
right.
All
So,
right, we're getting.
so, so yeah. So I had this job. I mean, I had this business doing interior design,
Yeah.
and it was when the housing crash happened, and like all my friends that were business owners,
Oh
because
eight
I
oh
knew a lot of
nine.
people who were business owners, huh?
Oh 0809. That's where we're talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was like 07, 08, 09,
Oh
right.
0708. Yeah.
And everyone was just like freaking out and panicking, and everybody was just feeling very discouraged. And so in the midst of that, people would call me for encouragement, even though I had my own business and I was struggling. And so at the time I decided to write, you know, using like the Bible and just using, you know, words to encourage and talking about how you could use um, you know, your religious beliefs to help encourage you in business, because there are a lot of little nuggets tucked into the Bible, but we just don't because we don't interpret it in that way, we just don't see those things. So,
yeah.
so my first book was called My Business His Way.
And we didn't
And
talk
so,
about your faith background, but you come from a family with a strong faith tradition. Am I
yeah,
correct? Yeah.
yes, yeah. I grew up Pentecostal, and if you know anything about Pentecostals, they're hardcore. They're hardcore. They're hardcore Christians. And my mom is actually a preacher. She was a pastor at one point. So,
So you're a PK.
and yeah, and like her side of the family, my mom's side of the family, it's like a bunch of preachers on that side. So
Mm.
that was one conversation I had with God over and over again. I'm not gonna be a preacher. I'm not marrying a preacher. Do we understand each other? It's like, yeah, because that kind of thing. When you have a family that does the same thing, it's easy to feel pressure to move into that same
Sure.
direction.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
yeah. So I dodged that bullet, but but it
Was
did
that a
have
tough, was that a tough conversation, or were they like, no, we know you're not going to be a preacher?
no. That was my conversation with God.
Oh, with
That
God.
was yeah.
Was God okay with that? Was God?
Well, I think he was like, okay, I hear you, so we've been doing well with it.
But I'm gonna keep pushing this writing thing until you actually pick it up. It sounds
Right,
like
right. So yeah, I think for me it was really it was the writing thing that I was gifted with. So after that, like I put out my first novel, and then I ended up putting out a series that started with this book called Wife 101, and it was Christian fiction, and it really kind of took off. And so for some years, I was focusing on book writing, novel writing mostly. I did a
The
couple of
Wife
novels.
101 was a novel series.
So yes, it was called the Wife 101 series, and it was just about relationships and using, teaching how to be. It was using biblical principles, but teaching people how to be, I guess, better prepared in their relationships by using spiritual advice. But it was through a novel form, so it would be a story, and by the end of the story, you would learn something, by watching these characters type thing. So a little fiction mixed in with fiction. I've always been an educator deep down, so like I can't help but like give you some entertainment and then try to educate you low key. So in the midst of that, like I kind of felt the pull to go back to school. And by that time I had finished my doctorate, and I never wanted to go back to school after that dissertation. I was like so anti-school. And so about 5 years after I finished my—
That was in educational leadership.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to go back to school. I was like, okay, I think I got it all out of me. But then like 5 years later, I felt like, okay, you've trained yourself to do all this other stuff. If you're really going to stay in writing, you need to train yourself there too. And so I ended up going to the to SCADS, the Savannah College of Art and Design in Savannah, Georgia. And I started off as a professional writing major, but after about 2 terms there, I switched over to dramatic writing.
Professional writing would be like what sort of writing?
Nonfiction writing for articles, for magazines, other publications.
Because ideally, all writers would like to get paid and be professional with their
right. Right. It's the professional writing. I mean, it could even go into some fiction stuff, but it's really more, it's really more, instead of being so on the creative side, it's the business of writing. Like a lot of professional writers may right now get into content writing on websites and that type of thing.
All kinds.
There's a lot of writing jobs out there right now because everything you see that's written, there's a writer behind it.
Yeah.
So, but I started taking these dramatic writing courses with TV writing and stuff, and I loved it. And then I switched over. And when I switched over majors, the first class I took as a new major was playwriting.
Nice.
And so the first play that I wrote in that class ended up being a play that was nominated for some things that ended up going to some national theater festivals, and
nice.
It won awards. And it was just like, okay, I guess this thing is for me. So yeah, that's kind of how I got started on the dramatic side, is starting off with the book stuff and then kind of naturally flowing into writing plays, writing screenplays, writing more for performance versus just within a book.
Nice. Fantastic. So you're in Savannah. It's probably by now, what, 2010, 2011?
Well, by the time I went to SCAD, I went to SCAD, I think in 2015.
2015.
Um,
Okay.
but yeah, when I first got to kind of the middle Georgia, more coastal Georgia area, it was like about 2010
Yeah.
on there.
Gorgeous part of the country. Just
Yes.
absolutely beautiful down there. So and you're starting to do your playwriting. You're starting to do more theater. So you've really been writing for theater for about what, 5-7 years, somewhere in there?
No, actually, let's see, how long has it been? Yeah, well, it's been it's really been about 4 years.
4 years. So that's fantastic.
Yeah,
I mean,
about 4 years.
you obviously a wide-ranging background and a
Mm,
rich writing background.
right.
Before that, do you still find yourself working in sort of multiple genre, multiple sorts of different kinds of things, or are you really more focused on the playwriting at this point?
I'm still into the screenwriting, as far as writing for TV, writing for film, but playwriting is the area I focus on most.
Yeah.
Um, I do believe in moving in your flow. And so the minute I started writing for theater, it just started flowing. Like opportunities were just like in front of me. So,
Gotcha.
you're not going to look at opportunity. They say, well, that's not what I think I'm supposed to do right now. You just kind of say, okay, I'll go with that.
Yeah.
And so then opportunities opened up, such as, working at Grandview and working with the theater department in Grandview. So,
And when did you
um,
arrive at Grandview?
so I was during all that time I was teaching. So I started teaching for college back in 2010,
Mhm.
and then the last college I was at, I was teaching English, and because I first started off teaching in the social sciences, teaching psychology, sociology, that type of stuff.
Right.
And then as I started to work on my degree in writing, then I started teaching English. Um, and then at that point, I found myself, I was teaching a lot of comp courses, and that really wasn't what I was interested in. I was really interested in writing creatively, because that had been, really the majority of my background with writing. I mean, I can write a paper all day. I can write a research paper all day, but that doesn't make me happy. So yeah, I did a job search, and I saw the opportunity at Grandview. So I am, my official title is, I am their um, Breda Endowed Chair of Creative Writing. And so that job includes a mixture between teaching both English classes and teaching theater classes, as well as overseeing a summer writing program for high school students.
Outstanding. And how long have you been in that position?
2 years.
2 years. So this
Yep.
is the end of your second year here in Iowa. And let's talk a little bit about you have a fascinating history, and I could spend hours unpacking some of the things we just lightly touched on. But we should probably talk about Mahala Island
Yeah.
in theory, since this is sort of a companion piece to our recording of that. What tell us a little bit, set the stage a little bit for folks about Mahala Island, sort of what the context is, and then I'd also like to sort of delve into what sort of sparked your interest in telling this kind of story. It's a really a fascinating story in terms of not only the issues, but for me as a North Carolinian, I love that you said it on the Carolina coast, South Carolina, but that's still okay. Um, but it talks about some of the real talks about so many different things that I just kind of want to get set the stage for us first a little bit, and let's talk about what sparked your interest in this story.
Okay, so Mahala Island follows three couples. They are diverse couples. There is a couple who, Black woman and man, who are engaged.
Mm-hmm.
And the woman, it is her cottage. Her family has owned a cottage and passed it down through generations. That is on Mahala Island. And so Mahala Island is a fictitious island that is that is a part of the Sea Islands, which are off of the coast of the Carolinas and Georgia. These islands really exist, but Mahala Island isn't one of them.
Okay.
There's like over 100 islands there.
Have a particular reference to you, or just kind of sound good, or like where did Mahala come from?
So Mahala is it's an African word,
Mm-hmm.
and it means free or freedom.
Nice.
And so yeah, so there is some meaning there. and so this particular island is supposed to be owned all by Black people. And within the Sea Islands, there is a culture of the Gullah culture is a part of that island. So, and so it's kind of connected to that, where she's basically a descendant of the Gullah people. And so
And just
she invites.
I just want to touch on that for a second for folks who may be, maybe our Midwest fans who aren't as familiar with the Gullah culture or the sort of significance of that within the American South. This is an African culture that came over in the time of American slavery and has had a tremendous impact on food and culture throughout the South. A tremendous, often unrecognized impact. Well, tell us a little bit about that. If you have a sort of what sort of inspired you about that culture in that area.
Well, especially living and working in Savannah and whatnot, you hear a lot about Gullah people, as well as I've had friends that have had family that are a part of that culture. And so the one thing about the Gullah people is that, like you said, they were Africans that were brought over during slavery. But because they were working and living and whatnot on these islands, they were able to preserve some of their culture. So instead of completely assimilating over into American culture, they kept language, they kept food, they kept certain practices and traditions because they were kind of separated and isolated from the mainland. So, so when you see, when you meet people that are part of the Gullah culture, you definitely get a good sense of richness of culture, and you see a lot more connections to African culture and whatnot. And so, yeah, like you said, the food and the language and the history is a lot more preserved for that group of people.
So you've set this on this fictitious Sea Island in South Carolina, and Amina Freeman, her family owns this particular house. Whether it's a family house or a vacation house comes up in the first scene. Keep going with who these folks are and sort of what the setting is. Thank you.
Okay, so she's engaged to this guy named Terrell, and Terrell is fraternity brothers with two other guys. And so Terrell attended a predominantly white school for undergrad, and he pledged this fraternity. And so he's been friends with these other two guys. So the other two guys are Darren, who is a Black guy who's married to a white woman named Heather. And then there's Connor, who's a white guy who's married to a white woman named Emma. And so you get three different kind of perspectives, because you get an African-American couple, a mixed race interracial couple, and then a white couple, which is intentional because it's like, okay, let's throw all these things in one pot and see what happens. And so you have the brotherhood, which is these three fraternity brothers that are connected through their fraternity, even though they may have different outlooks on life. And then, you have the women that are either in relationships with, who the women aren't really connected outside of their relationships with these men. But then on top of that, you have the natural issues you would have in your relationship. Things that, even though you're on vacation, whatever you have going on at home, it's still going on.
And your baggage comes with you when you travel.
Comes with you. Right. And so Connor is kind of our antagonist. He likes
he's the white man who's married.
Yes.
He's actually the only white man in the play.
Right. So he's that guy that he's rich, and he kind of has the attitude like, this is who I am, just deal with it. And it's annoying to a lot of people, most of the people in the house. So he's a fun character because he likes to stir the pot. Amina is the only Black woman in the play. So she's the only one to kind of provide that perspective. And then you have, two white women, two Black males. And so basically they all get to this cottage for this vacation. And while they're there, they hear a news report that that it's possible that a hurricane may come their way. And they have to decide if they're going to stay on the island or not, if they're going to leave. And in the midst of all of that, they're dealing with their both internal issues within their marriages, their issues with each other as friends, the cross issues of people, like Amina and Connor don't get along because Connor He thinks it's okay to wear Confederate stuff and whatnot. And Amina is a African American studies professor, so she's like, nah, take that off. And so it's just
He does not share that perspective. It's safe to say.
Yeah, right. So putting a bunch of, it's kind of like real world for like adults, like real adults. Like, what happens when you put 6 couples in a house,
Exactly.
and bring a hurricane along?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
So you set up this very rich, loaded situation, and then you bring the sort of inciting external incident of the hurricane into play, with it sort of bearing down on them. But the choice of the hurricane, in terms of our conversations, choice of the hurricane was not random or coincidence. It was very intentional that you had some things you wanted to kind of explore, looking at this natural disaster. Tell us a little bit about, share with the audience a little bit about, because I don't want to tell too much of the story, because there's so much. That's kind of set the stage. You'll have to watch the reading to kind of get where all these things go, but you can kind of see where there's a lot of potential for conflict as we do in the theater. But the choice of the hurricane, again, looking at some very, very specific, very real, very current issues in terms of how we deal with disasters, essentially,
right,
natural or otherwise. So why did you make that particular choice? What was exciting or rich to you about that particular situation?
Well, so when I lived in Atlanta, it was during Hurricane Katrina, and so I was able to witness a lot of people evacuating from the Gulf Coast to Atlanta, and being displaced, and seeing, not being in the Gulf Coast myself, but seeing the outcome of these people having to move and not have anything, and struggle with waiting for FEMA to pay, or seeing if State Farm or what other insurance companies would pay out, that type of thing. And so kind of just seeing the lasting effect on it from being in one of the cities that was that a lot of people went to. So I got that. And then and so ever since then, I really have been interested in Katrina, as far as just seeing how devastating it was as a hurricane, but just also how much, because it was an area that had a lot of people of color, how there was so much criticism about the government and the lack of response and the lack of help, and how long it took. And then, years later, we saw Hurricane Maria that, that few years ago hit, Puerto Rico. And, and how our government just really, really mistreated Puerto Rican people. How, we saw the images of Trump out there throwing paper towel rolls, and just, it took them, I think, almost a month to get any type of aid, and people saying Puerto Rico is not, United States, we don't have to take care of them. And really, it's, it is a part of the United States. Yeah. And so just people not.
For anyone who confused, Puerto Ricans are American citizens.
Right.
It's a territory of the United States.
Right.
It's a state, but it is a territory of the United States. And
right.
The loss of life from Hurricane Maria was roughly comparable to the loss of life from 9/11. It was right. A disaster on a massive scale.
Exactly. And so for us to be so casual and refusing to do anything, or people to not know that it was a part of the United States, or not feel like they deserved help. And then just kind of watching documentaries and whatnot about, people having, a lot of people came to the States after that, like New York City and whatnot, because they could not live in their homes. And, after a period of time, still could not go back, but were forced to go back because the funding ran out. Right. And just to watch how we treat, Americans. I mean, like, we are one of the wealthiest countries in this world. And to see how we treat people, especially people of color, during natural disasters. And this is the first time, this isn't the second time. We could go back into history and look at, there was a hurricane called Okeechobee that happened in the early 1900s. And it wiped out, thousands of people of color in Florida. And nobody talks about it, and I was first introduced to that hurricane when I read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And so like, we just, like there's certain things that happen and we're just like, oh my gosh, we got to help them. And then there's other things that happen. We're like, that's not our community. We don't care about it. So,
Yeah.
so I really have always been interested in that topic. And then last year, Grandview brought a professor for our Global Vision Week in to talk about environmental justice, which is really just the idea that we tend to take vulnerable populations and put them at risk for environmental hazards, which includes natural disasters, but it also includes things like, like for example, we talk about these 5G towers right now that could be problematic because of the radiation. It could cause issues with cancer or whatever. We don't know right now, but there's a lot of concern about that. But a lot of those towers are going to go up in lower income neighborhoods. So more vulnerable populations, people of color, lower income, white people, so that is what environmental justice is, really about. So there's a professor, Dr. Robert Bullard. He's kind of like the grandfather of this whole thing. He's like the first person who did research on, where are landfills, why are more landfills in communities of color, that type of thing. Right. So I read about him back in college and undergrad. And last summer when I knew he was coming to Grandview, I started reading more of his stuff so that once he got to Grandview, I could talk to him intelligently. Right. And in the midst of that, I was just like, okay, I had all these different thoughts in my head. And I'm like, okay, I've always wanted to look into these hurricanes. Like, this is perfect. And so that's kind of where the idea of the premise behind the hurricanes from Mahala Island came in. And just wanting to kind of think and consider, this topic of how we deal with communities of color during natural disasters.
And just to touch on some of those thoughts, I think there's an awfulness to the idea by itself that, well, we're going to make sure that poor communities are the ones that are where, if we're going to cite a dump or if we're going to cite a power plant or if we're going to cite something, it's going to be in a poor community, so it's not in a rich community. That's a terrible enough idea in and of itself, and of course all too common and somewhat expected, frankly. At this point, we don't expect that we're going to cite these polluting entities right near the wealthiest homes in the community. That's never allowed. That's never an option. It's always going to be near where the poor folks live. But what you're saying, and the doctor, and the doctor whose name I didn't,
Dr. Bullard.
Dr. Bullard.
Yeah.
It's not just that. There's a layer beyond just the sort of economic discrimination or the pushing off of polluting areas to the poor, or a slower move to rebuild poorer areas. There's another layer to this. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So you have, like, even if you look at it in Des Moines, we're in Des Moines. So one of my classes last semester, in the fall semester, we looked at where our, waste management facilities in Iowa, where are, some of these facilities that give off a lot of pollution. And, we found like in the southeast section of Des Moines, there's like a slaughterhouse, there's like a Tyson factory, and there's like a landfill, all in like this one community. And so there's that level of, so you have these toxins and pollutants in certain areas, and those areas line up with the redlining maps from the 30s, where certain communities, especially communities of color, can only live, like Black people can only live in a certain part of Des Moines. So all those things line up. So you have that.
This, for folks who may be less aware of that history, this was actual policy in many places enshrined into law, where there were communities where we would not lend money for mortgages for people to buy their homes, even after World War II with the GI Bill. These communities were intentionally excluded from that and drew literally a red line around them to say, not these folks. And we're talking about communities of color, Black communities predominantly, in my understanding.
Right. Yeah. So and there's a really great redlining, like if you're in Iowa, there right now there's it's called redesigning. I think it's called redesigning the
Polk County Housing Trust.
Yeah, I can't remember the title of it. Something like
redesigning or rethinking the red line, and I think they have these virtual tours where they can talk about this history and talk about these communities.
Right.
Polk County Housing Trust is the group that does that, and folks should check that out. It's really fascinating stuff.
and even if you're not in Des Moines, because they're doing it virtually right now, like
Yeah.
anybody could hop on to it. But yeah, they talk about, that idea of the fact that this was actually a federal policy where, banks were told, hey, you can lend to these particular areas if they're certain colors and certain letters, but if they're, red, or, if they were certain letters, you could not. Or, so it was, or certain people. And so of course the people who were like whites were in areas that were allowed to get the housing loans and whatnot, and the red areas were people of color, lower income people. So, and then we still see that, like if you look at the Des Moines area, you still see that those demographics. So like, I live out in Ankeny, and which was, not in the red line area. And so Ankeny's like 97% white. So, you still see that, years and years, decades later, how that plays an influence on socioeconomic status, housing loans, that type of stuff. So you have that level of environmental racism, but then you have on top of that, the natural disasters, and how those are handled. So, we can't, we don't control the environment, but then when it is time, when something does happen, how do we respond? What monies do we put, what communities do we put money into? How quickly do we get to those communities when it comes to help? And so, and it really doesn't benefit, like, if you think about it from a financial aspect, it's like, okay, well, like during Hurricane Katrina, if you take these communities of color, that were, flooded or whatnot, and you don't give those people money to help rebuild, they're going to lose their housing, which means that other people can come in and develop that land and basically take over the land. So, so there is a very economic part to it where, not only do you not care about those communities the way you care about other communities, but also the taking advantage of communities because of the fact that these people probably can't fight back. They don't have the resources, the legal power, the money to fight back the way a more affluent neighborhood could.
A particularly brutal kind of gentrification then.
Yes, yes.
Sort of in the wake of a natural disaster. And
Mm-hmm.
so Mahala Island was originally scheduled to be part of the Iowa Stage Scriptease play reading series
Mm-hmm.
in March,
Mm-hmm.
the last week of March of this year. Obviously, the COVID pandemic came through. The Cake, which was scheduled to open March 27th for us, that's been pushed into next season. And you and I had a conversation and said, well, let's try and do this virtually. Let's see if this is something that makes any kind of sense. At the same time, all of the themes that you're talking about in terms of the disparities in aid that go to communities of color, the historic neglect of resources, in this case, healthcare and aid, all of this is being played out on a grand scale in the response to the COVID pandemic.
Right.
Are you seeing, for Mahala Island, are you seeing parallels or resonances between that story and what we're all living through right now?
Definitely. I definitely see where when it comes down to testing, there are a lot of people who are wanting to be tested. If you're a celebrity, if you're rich, you can get tested easily. If you are kind of, just average Joe, or you're from a community color, a lot of people, we've seen a lot of news articles where people have said that they've been denied testing multiple times, and then you find out the person died from COVID. You also have just a treatment, how are people being treated? We see right now that there is, a disproportionate rate of African Americans and Latinos that are dying from COVID. So it's not just about an infection rate, it's also about who's dying.
And it's not like 3 or 4%. It's a
right. No,
huge difference.
Right. You have some cities where almost all of their patients are, African American. All the deaths are African American,
and that wildly out of proportion to the representation of African Americans within that population.
Right. You also have, even how people are being treated. Like, I know I read an article a day or two ago about how in New York City, how 75% of the people being arrested for not self-quarantining were African Americans, and then only maybe 5% or less were white, everybody in between were Latinx people. So like even that, like, how are you even treating within the criminal justice system, how are you treating citizens as far as responding to people's actions? So we kind of see these layers of this inequality and injustice that is targeted at people of color.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate for us as a society that these are issues that we're talking about over and over and over again, but it is certainly a rich theatrical and dramatic territory for you as a writer, that you have really framed up a situation which is independent and stands completely on its own as a play, but has what I would say are some really striking parallels to the present moment that you couldn't possibly have predicted or been aware of when you were writing this play over the last year or so.
Yeah. Well, being an educator, I'm always thinking as an educator as far as no matter what I write, I want to entertain, but I also want to inspire. I also want people to walk away from my plays, thinking about their lives, thinking about the lives of other people, wanting to be better people. And, and so, with plays are very subjective. When you read a play or watch a play, what you walk away with is going to be probably different from what the person sitting next to you walks away with.
Right.
And so I kind of love to drop little jewels, throughout the play so that everybody walks away with something. Nobody just says, oh, that was a good play, but, there's no bearing on their lives. But you can at least walk away, if it's nothing but the discussion of, is this real? Even if you walk away from the play saying, does environmental racism or environmental justice really exist? We know that we have, when Trump took over office in 2016, the EPA actually had a department for environmental justice underneath the EPA, which was something that was closed down under this administration. And so it's like, well, how do we deal with those things if the government isn't taking it seriously, but we see that there's enough evidence out there that, certain groups are not being taken care of, So, when we talk about things like, with Connor's role, he's very patriotic, like, like, this is my country. How could you be this way, Amina? But, how is Amina supposed to feel patriotic when she's watching people who look like her, not be treated the same way as people that look like him?
And I would say that certainly for me, patriotism doesn't mean unquestioning acceptance of everything that those in power do. I think if you love your country, you want it. If you love someone or something, you want it to be the best that it can be. And I think that when we fail the most vulnerable communities, that's not the best we can be, and that's not the best we can do as a country. So I think the act of a patriot at that point is to say, no, we can, must, and we can, should, and must do better.
Right.
That's just my take. I'm not trying to tell Amina how to feel.
Right, Amina. But then it's also, if we look at the relationships in the play, can, Connor, the sole white guy, can he take on these beliefs when his two best friends are people of color? You know what I mean? And so I think, it kind of gets into that idea, can you be racist if you have Black friends type thing, Yeah. And it's like, can you, your relationships with people, how does that impact or not impact what you're willing to do or stand for?
Well, and that's interesting too. I've been thinking a lot about Dr. Ibram X. Kendi and his talk about racist versus anti-racist, and you can it's in what you do and say. It's not somebody can say a racist thing and then do an anti-racist thing too. There's this mix of things that people can be. Connor is a little bit mixed in that, but he's fairly racist, but he does have these African American friends. So it's like, I think the relationships, the richness of the relationships in the play are really a great example of that. Of people, we're not binary. We don't hold only one idea. We're much more, believing 7 impossible things before breakfast than we are any sort of intellectual consistency,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, in many cases. And I really see that richness and that diversity and that humanity reflected in these characters you've drawn in the relationships that they have.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been a terrific conversation. Thank you so much. We could keep going for a long time, but appreciate you taking the time and appreciate you sharing Mahala Island with us and giving us the opportunity to push it out into the world and hopefully have some of those larger conversations that are so much a part of what you created.
Yeah, it's been fun, definitely, and I'm really hoping that, like I said, that if nothing else, people walk away wanting to know more. People checking out books by Robert Bullard, or like you said, you brought up Kendi. I had a class recently reading his book, How to Be Anti-Racist.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, just the reality, because I think a lot of times, if it's not your reality, if it's not your experience, we just kind of say, oh, that's not really happening, or it's hard for me to believe that's happening. And just because it's not your experience doesn't mean it's not real and it's not true, and that people are not experiencing it. So I know a lot of people, we talked earlier on in this interview about faith and religion, and a lot of people, say that they have a certain faith or religion, and most faiths, religions believe in love and taking care of people and looking out for people. So we say that that's who we are, but then when it comes down to seeing other people not be taken care of, it's like, well, did that really happen? And sometimes I think we use the excuse that because we don't see it, because it's not happening in our own community or with the people of color that we know, that, oh, that can't be true, they're just making a big deal about it. But here's the thing, what if they're not? What if this is really, really happening? And I noticed, like, here in Iowa, since I've been here, I noticed there are a lot of interracial relationships. There are a lot of children from those interracial relationships. And there's also a lot of interracial adoptions here. And so it's really important that people, if you're going to, have families that consist of people of color, because you're mixing, whether it's adoption, whether it's marriage and children, that you really understand what these children, what their lives are going to be like, because they're not going to be isolated to your family and your community forever. At some point, they'll probably move away. They'll go to another city, or sometimes they'll be in the same city. They'll go to the mall, they'll go somewhere, and there'll be this incident that happens. And if they're not prepared for, for the realities of how people of color are treated in this country, then it's going to be very shocking, very hurtful, and you're not going to be able to support them through it. And it could even lead to some resentment. And so this is where, like, even my psychology background comes into it, because I realize that, I'm talking about these issues, but I'm also talking about humanity and the reality that, here's somebody you love and they're going through something. They go to school and they're kicked out of class because of the hair, because of the hair policy doesn't include Black hairstyles or something like that. And you don't know what to do with it because you've never heard anything like this, and so how do you help the people that you say you care about? So Connor, how does Connor help the people that he cares about? He has these two best friends that are Black. Are you going to be there for them, or are you going to dismiss their experiences because it's not your own?
And for what happens with Connor, they're going to have to watch the play.
Right.
Yeah, and too, for folks who are more my ethnicity or in my cultural group, just because you have friends who are people of color and maybe they don't talk about this with you doesn't mean they don't go through it. Mm-hmm. It may not be part of the conversation that you've had yet, and mm-hmm. you may need to do your own listening and your own education and be responsible to yourself for your own educating, not expect communities of color to have the responsibility to educate white folks like me. Because that's an additional burden that you're placing on them. They're dealing with this, and then they have to educate, people like me about it. I think that's, it's important for us to be thoughtful and listening and exploring the world outside of whatever privilege, and I personally, I check every box of privilege there is, except for the fact that I'm left-handed.
You too.
For sure.
The people unite.
We live in a rightist society.
We do. But you're right, and on top of that, sometimes people of color that they haven't had those experiences yet. They've been
Yeah.
lucky to not have those experiences yet.
Yeah.
There was research back, I think, in the 70s by a man with the last name Cross who developed identity, like there's the identity development. And then there's been researchers since then that have talked about identity development for different races. And there's a period where, everything is good. You haven't had any of those bad experiences and you just believe all is love and there's no problems. And then something happens that brings you to the awareness that everything isn't perfect. And so it is possible that, if you're white, you could have friends that have never had experiences. And when you ask them, they're just like, I don't know what they're talking about. Everything's been all good for me. And that's great that's great if they've never had those experiences, but that doesn't negate all the other experiences of everybody else just because this one person or this pocket of people have not had those experiences.
And that's the sample size is really important when you're thinking about my circle of friends doesn't have that experience, so clearly no one else has that experience. That's just not a statistical or scientifically valid way to look at evidence.
Right. And also, there's also part of that identity where people they can't handle, once they have an experience, they can't handle what that means, that change that's going to, happen if they really embrace it. So then they kind of deny it and, try to kind of back out of it. And that happens even for white people. And so like when I'm working with my students, I always let them know, like, as you're getting this information, it can be so overwhelming because if you embrace it, it means you got to change. And some of us aren't ready to change. So it's easy to say, no, that's not really happening, or I don't believe it. And to say, okay, if I really believe it, that means that, when I'm at Thanksgiving dinner, it might be a different conversation, with that one uncle who always says something crazy, and instead of laughing at the joke, the racist joke, you say, hey, Uncle Pete, that's not cool. You know what I mean? So that can be difficult for people.
Absolutely. And but increasingly we live in a diverse society, and just thinking about, the United States for a second, it's important that we understand that diversity rather than being scared of it, or we understand other people's experiences and we take our own responsibility, particularly, again, I would say folks in my, ethnic group, for making sure that we're living up to our values rather than down to our fears.
Right.
There is a wonderful mix in this country of high lofty ambition and just craziness sometimes. So it's a little glimpse of my daughter back there. But well, Dr. Wilson, thank you so much. I could do this for another hour, but I think folks probably want to get on with their day a little bit. But they should absolutely watch the video of Mahala Island. We'll link to that in our description. And thank you for all the work that you're doing in the community. I've so enjoyed working with you on this project that Donna Scarf directed, the wonderful cast that we put together of Heidi Mason, Michael Tallman, Clifton Antoine, Emmett Phillips, and Jenny Bunton. Did I miss anybody?
Michaela Morris.
Michaela Morris, yes. Thank you very much. Who pinch hit it for us. She stepped in at the last minute when we had an actor who was unable to join us. So thank you so much for the opportunity and for the play and for the conversation today. This has been great.
Definitely. And thank you guys for taking a chance on Mahala Island.
Oh, it's a fascinating play, and I think folks are going to really enjoy it. All right. Thank you.